Hi, I'm Thomas. Welcome back to Pilot's Workshop, and welcome to the second episode of our Workbench series. After preparing the large boards for the top frame in the first episode, we now want to prepare the necessary joints to connect everything into a solid frame, as well as the groove where the table surface is going to rest on once the project is finished. So let's begin by making the long dovetails for the inner support structure. At first, I mark the position of the center line of each dovetail. Followed by the length of the dovetails. Finally, I am using my marking gauge to create a continuous line that marks the bottom of each dovetail, and that I will use to position my router template. So let me take a quick detour here to explain you a bit more about the router template. It's basically a square hole in a sheet of MDF. The shape of the square, containing the center line and the bottom line of the finished dovetail, I printed out on a sheet of paper and simply glued it on the MDF plate. I placed it so that I could easily clamp it to the board without the clamps being in the way of my router. I then pre-drilled from a jigsaw and cut out the inner square. Some rough sanding finished up the edges. When you look closely, you can see the center line as well as the bottom line. The distance between the bottom of the square and the bottom line, as well as the width of the square, can easily be explained. The copy ring of the router has a diameter of 33 mm, while the bottom of my dovetail bit has a diameter of only 19 mm. But now back to the topic at hand. The router template was placed along the center and bottom line that I just marked and clamped in position. And this is our finished setup. The routing operation is straightforward, but because we're working with a dovetail bit, it is important to plunge the full depth on the first pass. When routing, I always do two passes. First a slow one to remove the material, and then a second quick one to clean up the edges. After this first routing operation, we're gonna leave the long dovetails alone for a bit to take care of the groove for the table surface. This begins by marking the thickness of the table surface, in my case 21 mm, along each board. Then the groove can be cut out using a large straight bit and the parallel guide of your router. But because the groove is as big as it is, it couldn't be done in one pass this time. Instead, it had to be done in 4 passes, nibbling away a quarter of the material at each pass. And you can see that I asked a friend to help me at this point, which makes this operation much easier and also much more fun. So this is how far we got at this point. The groove for the table surface is finished, and the short and long dovetails have been cut. But the edges still have to be cleaned up, and the bottom of the dovetail still has to be straightened. The marked bottom line of the dovetails is at the same height as the bottom of the dovetails due to the shape of the dovetail bit. So in the next step, this has to be cleaned up with a chisel. Finally, all that's left to prepare at this point are the dovetail joints at the corners of the top frame. And because they are too large and in general unpractical to make with a router, I cut them by hand. So after marking the adjacent sides of the boards, the thickness of the first board can be transferred to the other one using the marking gauge. When you are marking something with a gauge or in general with a knife, it is important to first do the lightest of passes to give the knife a groove to run in, and to then press a little bit more in the next passes to create a groove deep enough so you can easily see it and work with it. And then it's time to mark the outlines of the dovetails. I always like to mark the area of the waste stock, learning from bad experiences. I like to take my time with these more complicated marking jobs, drawing all the necessary lines on all sides of the wood, because the better the preparation, the faster and more relaxing the work becomes later on. And then it was finally time to cut the dovetails. Next, the waste stock has to be taken out, and I did this with a chisel. And because I don't have a workbench yet, the most stable way for me to do this was to put the board on the pile of beams that I already bought for the leg assembly and to simply sit on it. And this is where the groove from the marking gauge comes in handy. Because the fibers on top are already cut, the chisel can be placed a millimeter away from the line, and with the slightest of taps, the material in between can be taken out, producing the tiniest of shoulders for the chisel to rest against. Then a slightly bigger tap and a slightly bigger tap, and this way you can make sure that the dovetail ends perfectly on the line that we previously marked with the marking gauge. And again from a different angle, a slight tap, rest against the shoulder, and a lightly stronger tap. Getting started for the removal of the bulk material. Then the workpiece can be turned around, and after the same procedure has been done on that side as well, the waste material can be removed more rapidly, without having to fear that the outlines of the dovetail change. And after almost arriving on the other end, the workpiece can be turned around again, and the rest of the material can be chiseled out in one go. After that, the outlines of the dovetails can be directly transferred to the adjacent edge, and the procedure repeats itself. after all that work, the dovetails are almost finished. Mine didn't quite fit at this moment, and so I made a few pencil marks where I had to remove material. At this point, the upper edge can receive a small miter, just for good looks. Thin shavings are carefully taken off the marked areas, and the miters can be properly marked and cut. A dry fit then ensures that the two halves go together smoothly. And after all four edges received the same treatment, I could prepare the glue up. Now my workshop floor is really less than straight, so I used a laser level to make sure that my workbench doesn't end up warped. I put a good amount of slow setting wood glue in every corner of the dovetail joints. Then it was finally time for the assembly. Every corner was checked for the square, and the diagonals were checked. If the diagonals are exactly the same, that means that the overall construction is square. And finally, measuring the distance from the laser down to the edge of the workbench made sure that the frame is not warped. And after clamping up the joints, everything was checked again. And that's it for this video. In the next episode, we are going to finish up the frame by making the inner support structure. So make sure to also stop by next time. And if you want, you can watch some of my other videos. Until then, this is Pilot's Workshop. Thank you for watching.